Hi, I'm going to present the paper Don't Accept All and Continue, Exploring Nudges for More Deliberate Interaction with Tracking Consent Notices. My name is Alina Gerber, and this is joint work with Alina Stöver, Peschke, and Verena Zimmermann. So if a user visits the website, usually tracking technologies such as cookies are set on the devices of website visitors. The collected data is then used, for example, for personalized advertising. Now, if this user visits from an EU country, the GDPR requires informed consent for this tracking. This is usually implemented by showing a tracking consent notice. Most of these consent notices, however, perform poorly from an HCI perspective and are thus often perceived more as a nuisance than as an opportunity to modify privacy settings. Hence, instead of promoting a self-determined, informed decision, most consent notices trigger an automated binary behavior. That is, all optional tracking technologies are either accepted or rejected without further thought. This binary behavior is problematic both for website visitors and website operators. While giving uninformed and non-deliberate consent deprives website visitors of sovereignty over the handling of their private data, rejecting all optional tracking technologies is also bad, not only for website operators, whose business model is often based on data collection, but possibly also for website visitors, as they are no longer able to make an informed decision that also takes into account the possible benefits of tracking technology use. So this raises the question of how consent notices should be designed to allow website visitors to actually make a self-determined decision about online tracking. Prior research has, for example, explored how consent notices should be designed to nudge users towards rejecting all optional tracking technologies. In contrast to that, we aim to nudge users towards a more deliberate interaction with the consent notice and thus preserve the opportunity for website operators to use optional tracking technologies, but based on an informed decision. For this, we compare nudge designs that rely on different nudging concepts. We conducted a controlled between-subject online experiment with 167 participants who are already familiar with consent notices as they resided in countries that were subject to the GDPR. We implemented a realistic research environment by using a cover task, which was to evaluate a new online shop that we created for the study. When the participants opened the online shop website, one of the 5 different consent notices was displayed. And these are the different consent notice designs. We investigated 3 nudges that rely on different nudging concepts. Color highlighting, in which the Save Current Settings button is colored green and the Accept All and Continue button is colored red. The social queue, in which a fictional number of other users who accepted the different tracking technologies is displayed beside the settings for these technologies. And a timer, which blocks both decision buttons for 10 seconds. We further included a consent notice that follows an opt-in procedure and another consent notice that follows an opt-out procedure to study the effect of default settings. These nudges can be classified based on the framework proposed by Hansen and Jespersen that clusters nudges based on whether they are transparent, which means easily visible to the user, as opposed to nudges that are not obvious to the user. And they further differentiate between nudges that primarily target automatic cognitive processes and those that aim to activate reflective thinking. The opt-out and opt-in consent notices from our study both had certain options pre-selected per default. Because of that, they primarily target automated decision-making and might not be fully transparent to the users. The color nudge is hard to miss visually, and we thus assume it to be transparent. Our aim was to target reflective thinking by highlighting the interaction with the tracking settings, but we do not know whether this worked as intended. Because of that, depending on whether the users automatically clicked the green button or reflected on their choice, this nudge either target automatic cognitive processes or reflective thinking. The timer nudge prevented a selection before the time was up, so this nudge seems to be very transparent for the users. By interrupting automatic cognitive processes and triggering active reasoning, this nudge targets reflective thinking. The social norm nudge was based on a text and thus also transparent to the users. This nudge also targets reflective thinking. On the right, you can see the interaction times with the different consent notices. The opt-in group interacted with the consent notice for the shortest time with an average of 7.8 seconds, followed by the color nudge with an average of 9.4 seconds, and the opt-out group with an average of 9.6 seconds. The social nudge was processed for 12.5 seconds on average. This suggests that the additional information about the social norm was at least perceived and perhaps also caused an interruption of automated thinking. The timer nudge was open for an average of 13.8 seconds. However, opening this consent notice for less than 10 seconds was only possible if the window was clicked away. Thus, the long interaction time with the timer nudge is likely influenced by the 10-second timer itself and not necessarily by fostering a deliberate interaction with the consent notice. We calculated a Kruskal-Wallis test, followed by pairwise comparisons using Mann-Whitney U-test and Bonferroni-Holm corrections of the alpha level, and found that participants in the timer nudge group interacted significantly longer with the consent notice than participants in the opt-in condition, the color nudge, and the opt-out group. We also found increased click rates for the Save Current Settings button in the nudging and opt-in groups. As compared to the opt-out group, this button was clicked most frequently in the social nudge condition. However, Fisher's exact test showed no significant differences between the answers after applying Bonferroni-Holm corrections to account for multiple testing. Although our focus is not on acceptance or rejection, we were also interested in how many participants in the different groups accepted or rejected optional tracking. All participants who accepted the use of tracking technologies for analytical purposes also accepted the use of tracking technologies for marketing purposes and vice versa, with one exception, that is one participant in the opt-out group accepted the use of tracking technologies for analytical but not for marketing purposes. And because of that, we focus our analysis on the acceptance values for tracking technologies for marketing purposes. While 75% of the participants in the opt-out group accepted tracking technologies for marketing purposes, the acceptance rate was much lower in the opt-in group and when a nudge was present. The social nudge seems to have the greatest effect on the acceptance of tracking technologies for marketing purposes. Only 10% of the participants who interacted with this nudge accepted the use of tracking technologies for marketing purposes. To test these differences statistically, we conducted a logistic regression. We included privacy concerns, cookie knowledge, technical affinity, and self-esteem as covariates following a stepwise procedure. We selected the opt-in design as control, since all three nudge designs were an extension of the opt-in design, and thus the results reflect how the nudges add to the effect of the default settings. The third model, which includes all covariates, correctly predicts 84.7% of the data. From the consent notice designs, only the default setting significantly predicts the acceptance of optional tracking technologies. The odds ratio here indicates that a participant in the opt-out group is 11.8 times more likely to accept optional tracking technologies than a participant in the opt-in group when we control for privacy concerns, cookie knowledge, technical affinity, and self-esteem. From the covariates, only the collection scale of the IUI-PC8, measuring privacy concerns, is a significant predictor for accepting optional tracking, with a participant who scores 1 point higher on the scale, which means that this participant expresses higher privacy concerns in terms of data collection, is 1.69 times more likely to reject optional tracking technologies. So what did we learn from our study? First, our results highlight the importance of default settings. When we reverse the settings from an opt-out to an opt-in procedure, the acceptance of optional tracking technology use is significantly reduced. However, our results also show that this does not necessarily inspire a more deliberate interaction with the tracking settings. A possible solution to address this might be to combine opt-in default settings with a nudge that encourages deliberate interaction. Based on the descriptive interaction times and buttons clicked in our study, nudges based on the social cue might be a promising solution. Further, our participants hardly differed between accepting tracking technologies used for analytical and those used for marketing purposes, which usually means to show personalized advertising. However, these are two fundamentally different contexts of use. Usually only aggregated data is analyzed for analytical purposes, while to show personalized advertisement, individual profiles are created. Also, the potential benefits for users differ considerably between these two cases. Many users actually appreciate personalized advertising, while the individual benefits of general usage analysis is rather abstract. There are at least two possible explanations for that finding. Either our results indicate that current consent notice designs fail to inform users about the risks and benefits associated with the use of tracking technologies for different purposes. In that case, designers of such consent notices should consider to include specific information about these aspects in their consent notices. But the results can also be seen as an indication that users' privacy preferences are not primarily purpose-related, which means that asking users to consent to data collection for different purposes, as it is currently done by consent notices, is not a meaningful differentiation. Perhaps other dimensions, such as the sensitivity of the collected data or whether the data is shared with third parties, might reflect users' actual privacy preferences better. Our results further indicate that the decision to accept or reject the use of optional tracking technologies is influenced by privacy collection concerns and not awareness of data collection practices or online tracking technology knowledge. We would therefore recommend privacy advocates and researchers who aim to develop privacy interventions to focus on conveying information, knowledge about the particular risks and benefits associated with using optional tracking technologies to increase knowledge about the actual data collection instead of trying to raise general privacy knowledge or awareness. So to conclude, we learned that nudges have the potential to support a more deliberate interaction with tracking settings, and that a combination of opt-in default settings and a nudge based on a social cue might be a promising approach for this.